Hello, this is Kelly Dyer, and I'm presenting to you on behalf of the ANNA Research Committee. And this module is part of a component of a 5-part research series that's been developed by the 2020 ANNA Research Committee. And this module is to provide you knowledge and skills to help you design and implement qualitative health research and to help you manage and analyze qualitative data. And you can find more information on the ANNA website at the web address that's provided here. In this presentation, we'll begin with an introduction and an overview of qualitative research, and then next we'll consider examples of problems and questions that are appropriate for qualitative research. We'll briefly cover some types of qualitative research before we discuss ways in which data are collected, managed, and analyzed within qualitative research studies. We'll also discuss how to provide trustworthiness and rigor before we discuss some consideration for mixed methods. And finally, we'll close with issues related to reporting qualitative and mixed methods research. And these are our objectives for this presentation. We want you to be able to describe research questions and problems that are appropriate for qualitative investigations. We also want to summarize qualitative approaches for research based on the methodology. We want to explain data collection techniques for qualitative research and help you understand mixed methods appropriate for research inquiry. So let's begin with an introduction and overview of qualitative research. The first thing to consider related to qualitative research is that the purpose is not for testing of interventions. Instead, qualitative research is seeking to understand an experience, and we often call that experience a phenomenon. While quantitative research is used to test theories, qualitative research may be used to develop a theory. And similarly, qualitative research is often used to answer questions. For example, a qualitative researcher might want to explore the experience of waiting more than 5 years to receive a kidney transplant. Another qualitative focus to answer a question may be to explore the ways or processes nurses use when experiencing a patient withdrawing from chronic hemodialysis treatment. Because qualitative research is exploring the experiences of others, it explains and describes a phenomenon by using words instead of using numbers or statistical measures. Through the use of words, the world of others can become visible. Qualitative research is known for sharing the words of the participants in describing and explaining the phenomenon. And this aids us in developing new perspectives that consider the context of those who are having the experience. So for this reason, the qualitative researcher is entering the natural setting of the participant. And what this means is that the researcher doesn't bring the participant into a research lab, but instead considers the full context of the participant and where they live and exist. Qualitative research is also inductive in nature, which means that generalizations are developed from specific observations. So for example, the qualitative researcher may find that the participants described frustrations waiting on kidney transplant were reduced by volunteerism. Thus, the researcher might make the recommendation that nephrology nurses can suggest civic action to patients waiting on a transplant. So now let's move on to discussing problems and questions within qualitative research. Before we consider more specifics about choosing a qualitative methodology, let's discuss when you might choose to do a qualitative research study. You may hear some people state that they chose a qualitative study because little was known about something. And that's an insufficient rationale for choosing a qualitative study. Instead, it's important to note that the methodology must fit the research question. So we begin with the research question, and then we choose the methodology that's most appropriate to answer the question. And this allows the phenomenon of interest to guide your selection. When you need to understand the nature of something or someone's experience, you would choose a qualitative method. So when a personal account of those who experience the phenomenon is needed to answer the question, a qualitative methodology is appropriate. Let's consider some problems that might prompt a qualitative study. First, when an area is unexplored or a new perspective is needed, we might choose a qualitative study. We might also expand existing knowledge through a qualitative study. So for example, we might have a strong evidence related to the experience of being a husband caring for their spouse with chronic heart disease who is waiting for a heart transplant. Much of what's known might be applicable to nephrology nursing. However, if no one has explored the experience of being a wife caring for a spouse waiting for a kidney transplant, we may need to expand our existing knowledge to be relevant for the population of interest. Qualitative research can also explore personal experience. This is often accomplished through using phenomenology. And finally, qualitative research can be used to develop a new theory or to expand an existing theory. After identifying the problem and the purpose for conducting a study, the researcher can then write the research question. The research question to guide a qualitative study should focus on the experience, perceptions, thoughts, and feelings of those who are experiencing the event or situation. Research questions may have a gender focus or they may not. For example, the researcher may have a particular interest in women who are newly diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, or the interest may be more broad and gender not be identified. Research questions may also range from a constructive view to an interpretive view. In a constructivist view, there isn't a single truth, but instead the truth is constructed by the participant. In other words, the reality is that of the participants as they have experienced the world around them. In an interpretive view, the researcher is involved in interpreting what the participant has experienced and recognizes the impact of their own background and experiences. Research questions within a qualitative research study may also focus on a specific aspect of culture or social systems. When considering research questions within qualitative research, these will tend to be broad rather than specific. Writing research questions more broadly invites exploration and will ultimately be answered through providing what we call rich or thick descriptions. And what this means is that the words of the participants are provided in such a manner that you can understand the experience from their perspective. The way in which the question is written will vary depending upon the specific methodology needed to answer the research question. And there are several research methodologies that can be used to answer research questions. As I already mentioned, the research question should drive the selection of the methodology. We'll explore these specific methodologies a bit more later in the presentation, but here are some examples of possible research questions based on the methodology. And each of these examples revolves around adolescents receiving dialysis therapy. Phenomenology is focused on the lived experience of an individual. So a possible question focused on phenomenology might be to ask, what is the lived experience of being an adolescent requiring daily peritoneal dialysis? If you're interested on how this population walks through their daily life, you might choose grounded theory, which focuses on basic social processes. This is appropriate when we're asking how something happens. So you might write a research question to ask, how do adolescents requiring daily peritoneal dialysis navigate attending high school? Ethnography focuses on culture or social groups or systems. So a possible research question focused on ethnography might ask, what are the cultural norms present within a pediatric outpatient dialysis center? And this slide just offers you some additional examples of research questions that you might use as a template for writing a research question for your projects. Now let's move to discussing some specific qualitative methodologies. And this table offers you a succinct overview of 3 qualitative approaches, and we're going to move into discussing each of these more in depth. The philosophical origin of phenomenological studies is largely within philosophy and phenomenology. The focus is on learning and constructing the meaning of human experience and rests on the assumption that there is a structure and essence to shared experiences that can be narrated by the researcher. In other words, that the researcher can tell the story of the participants. In these studies, individuals serve as participants and the sample size tends to be smaller. Oftentimes you may see 10 or fewer participants in a phenomenology study. The focus of these studies is in-depth exploration of the lived experience of individuals, and this means gathering their stories as they lived them. The design is structured to explore the participants' descriptions of the experience, and data is typically collected through interviews or written descriptions. Written descriptions could be reflective writing, journal entries, or other narrative formats. Within phenomenology, the researcher has a key role and is often described as an instrument used within the study. This is because the researcher explores, analyzes, and then communicates the participants' descriptions of the experience. These findings are used to present a description of interpretation of the phenomenon experienced by the participants. Grounded theory derives its name because the theory is grounded in the data collected from the participants. And to achieve this, a researcher may hold off on conducting an in-depth literature review until after the study has been conducted, so that the data collected drives the theory production rather than the literature. The basis of grounded theory is within social sciences, and as such, it's used to construct a theory where no theory exists or where other theories have failed to provide evidence to explain the circumstances. The researcher is interested in social processes that arrive from the perspective of human interactions or patterns of actions. Within grounded theory, the sample size tends to be small, but will likely include at least 10 participants, but typically not more than 25 to 50 in total. Grounded theory also includes theoretical sampling, which is when the researcher seeks those experiences or participants that will aid the researcher in testing their hunches and completing the information. So as an example, if within a grounded theory study focused on how adolescents receiving peritoneal dialysis navigate attending high school, theoretical sampling may include the researcher interviewing school nurses or guidance counselors to confirm the administrative barriers that are present in managing complex health needs within a school setting. The focus of grounded theory studies is on identifying processes that occur within those social settings. However, social is broadly defined as understanding that every context or setting has some type of a social component. The design is structured to develop a theory, and it includes constant comparison of the data. To achieve this constant comparison, the data is analyzed as it's collected with open coding. And through this analysis, a theory is developed. Data collection typically occurs through in-depth interviews and observations within the setting. The researcher in a grounded theory project takes the role of observer and then also describes and analyzes the social processes that are uncovered. And the findings are then presented through a theoretical description of these basic social processes. Ethnographic studies have their philosophical roots within anthropology and the social sciences. And the focus is on providing a scientific description and interpretation of cultural or social groups and systems. Within ethnography, culture is broadly defined from the perspective that every social group has its own culture. The sample is the cultural group rather than the individuals. However, the researcher does seek to uncover the emic view, and the emic view is the view of the insiders who live within the culture or social group. So the researcher may engage in a meaningful way with these individual members within the group. And these individuals are known as key informants. Through engaging with the group and the key informants, the researcher will uncover the knowledge and shared meanings within the group or culture. The design is structured by the observations of the group and the interpretations of the researcher. The researcher may collect data through observing the group and the key informants, through interviews, through field notes made during observations, and through examination of documents and other artifacts. The researcher has multiple roles within an ethnographic study. First, the researcher has to acknowledge their perspective as being an interpreter who's entering an alien world and is attempting to make sense of that world. To do that, the researcher has to be open and disclose their beliefs and assumptions as a way to bracket or set aside their beliefs. And the researcher then has the roles of observer and may also become a participant in the group's activities. The researcher also must validate their findings with the cultural group before they can be finalized. And these findings are then presented as descriptions of cultural processes, meanings, and semantic rules. And next, we're going to talk about data collection techniques you might use in qualitative research studies. Data collection begins with recruitment and sampling. When designing a research study, the researcher must decide from which population they will recruit to have their sample. And this means identifying your target population. Your target population is defined as the complete set of people with specified characteristics. So let's go back to the example we've used throughout this presentation of adolescents who are receiving peritoneal dialysis. For this example, the population would be all adolescents who are receiving peritoneal dialysis. And you can imagine that this population would be broad and in such large numbers that no researcher could ever access all who meet that criteria. So for this reason, we narrow in on a subset of the population to determine the actual sample. And then this is further broken down into the intended sample and the actual sample. The intended sample is that subset the investigator intends to include. So continuing with our example, this may be all adolescents receiving peritoneal dialysis within a geographic region. And this would define the recruitment area, such as recruiting in the Pacific Northwestern region of the United States. However, your actual sample is those who participate in the study. Within quantitative research, we might consider generalization to consider whether the findings would be applicable to the larger population. In qualitative research, we talk about transferability in regards to extending the findings to the full population. So for this reason, we need to seek a sample that would be representative of the target population. However, there are some factors that we have to consider. These factors include selecting those who would represent the population, having an adequate sample size, and feasibility of accessing the population. For example, you have to consider, is the population easy to access, or would it be so challenging that you would prohibit adequate sampling? And we also have to ask what costs from a fiscal perspective must be expended to access or enroll the sample. There's two general methods of sampling through recruitment that we can consider. And these two general methods are non-probability sampling and probability sampling. Non-probability sampling is often used in qualitative research, and that especially includes purposive and snowball sampling. Probability sampling is more common when we're doing descriptive or quantitative research, so we're not really going to look deeply into that here. Qualitative research often uses non-probability sampling, because the goal is typically not to make sure that the sample matches the demographics of the population. However, because qualitative research does have a goal of describing the experience of the population of interest, it is crucial that the researcher includes those who have experienced the phenomenon. So for this reason, purposive and snowball sampling are strong methods of recruitment for qualitative studies. In purposive sampling, the researcher actively seeks those who have experienced the phenomenon. So staying with our example of adolescents who are receiving peritoneal dialysis, the researcher would implement purposive recruitment and sampling by passing out flyers about the study in the lobby of a pediatric dialysis center, by providing these flyers only to those who are adolescents, by emailing peritoneal dialysis nurses and asking them to share the research information with those who would be in the study population, or by sending the study information through a message board or group that serves this adolescent population. In snowball sampling, the researcher asks the participants in the study to share information about the study with other similar people. In this approach, the researcher might ask each participant to give a flyer to other adolescents they know who meet the study criteria. A convenience sample is exactly what it sounds like, in that the population is convenient to the researcher. So an example of this would be that the researcher works in a pediatric dialysis center and they recruit from the participants, the patients that attend that center for their dialysis treatments. To select a sample, the researcher must define who can participate and those who cannot. The criteria of who can participate is known as inclusion criteria, and this defines the main characteristics of the target population, and it might include demographic characteristics such as age, gender, race, or ethnicity. For example, the researcher who is interested in adolescents who are receiving peritoneal dialysis may specify the age range as 13 to 18 years of age, or they may specify the participant must be enrolled and attending high school. Clinical characteristics are those characteristics relevant to the study purpose and research question. In our example, the researcher is interested in those adolescents who are receiving peritoneal dialysis. Thus, the clinical characteristics might state participants must be receiving peritoneal dialysis, or they may state that the participant must have attended high school in person rather than being homeschooled. Geographic characteristics may not be applicable to every study. However, this can extend beyond geographic locations on a map. For instance, in our example study, the researcher may be interested in the experience of those who are in public schools only in rural areas. So the inclusion criteria may define that. Temporal characteristics are those that relate to time. So continuing with our example, this inclusion criteria may state the person must have been receiving dialysis for at least 12 months or have been enrolled in attending high school for at least 3 months. The focus of the study will determine any temporal characteristics that the researcher should define. Exclusion criteria specify the subset of the population that will be excluded or will not be studied. And this may be simply to clarify who cannot participate because they're not part of the population of interest. In our example, we're interested in adolescents receiving peritoneal dialysis. So adolescents receiving hemodialysis could not participate. However, exclusion criteria may exclude those who are likely to be lost to follow-up and fail to continue to participate. Exclusion criteria may establish those who cannot provide good data or who might be at a high risk of possible adverse effects from participating in the study. Next, we're going to talk about data management and analysis of the data. There's multiple methods for collecting data within qualitative studies. The first method is through written data, and this can include narratives prepared by the participants, with some being known as lived experience descriptions. Other written sources of data include asking participants to journal while experiencing something, asking for access to diaries previously written, asking for them to write a story, or exploring their experience through email communications or by accessing online media. Online media can include accessing social media postings or postings from message boards. Oral data most often includes interviews of some type. Interviews can be unstructured, semi-structured, and they can also be with individuals or with focus groups. In unstructured interviews, the researcher begins with one broad question that is asked of each participant. And after this, the interview progresses similar to a conversation where each subsequent question arises from the response of the participant. The researcher might ask probing questions to encourage the participant to elaborate or to clarify something the participant stated. In a semi-structured interview, the researcher prepares an interview guide with questions that will be asked of each participant. Based on the participant's responses, the researcher may ask follow-up questions to gain more information or insight, or to ask the participant to elaborate further. But every participant would be asked every question included in the interview guide. In a structured interview, an interview guide is also prepared in advance, and every participant is asked the same set of questions. However, unlike in a semi-structured interview, the researcher does not ask any probing or follow-up questions. They only ask the questions included on the interview guide. A focus group is when the researcher meets with 2 or more participants in a group format. The researcher prepares questions to ask to guide the focus group session. The researcher may serve as the moderator, or the researcher may have an independent moderator to guide the focus group discussion, while the researcher takes a role of observer and listener who doesn't offer comments or ask questions. Oral data may be gathered unrecorded or recorded, and it may occur in person or virtually. In unrecorded interviews, the only way the participants' words are captured are through the notes of the researcher. Because the goal of data collection is to gather the experience of the individual, most interviews are recorded in some fashion. Interviews may be audio recorded, video recorded, or both. An advantage of video recording is that this allows the researcher to watch the interview again and to evaluate the body language and movements of the participant and themselves. A disadvantage of video recordings is that people may be uncomfortable, and that may inhibit what they share. Often interviews are held in person in a location where the participant feels most comfortable. However, as technology evolves, more interviews are taking place virtually using web conferencing platforms. And one benefit of these web conferenced interviews is that the geographic boundaries that may narrow a recruitment area can be broadened. An interview can take place between the researcher and the participant, and both can be located in a variety of places. A disadvantage of web conference interviews is not all potential participants would have access to online technology, and they may not be comfortable using internet technology either. Finally, oral data must be transcribed in some way. Some additional methods of data collection include observations, field notes, photo voice, and artifacts. In observations, the researcher can approach observation in two different ways depending upon the goal of the study. As an example of unconsented observations, that might be observing ways in which children on a playground form groups. Because there's no interaction or manipulation of the children, consent may not be needed. The researcher would simply make notes and describe the behaviors observed. Further, because the consent isn't needed or obtained, the children would be unaware they're being observed, and the observation likely wouldn't influence their behaviors. So consider the ethnographic study example of cultural norms within a pediatric dialysis unit. For this type of observation, the researcher would closely observe interactions that demonstrate the cultural norms of the patients. So for this reason, the patients who are being observed would need to be consented and be aware that the researcher is present to observe them. The researcher would still gather data by perhaps taking photos, recording video or audio, and by making detailed written notes. Because the participants are aware, their behaviors may be influenced by the observation. Field notes are an additional source of data that's produced by the researcher. And these are notes taken during and immediately following an interview, review of written data, or observations. And these field notes often become part of the formal data available for analysis, especially in an ethnographic study. Photo voice or photo elicitation are similar, and both use photographs as data. In photo voice, participants are asked to take photographs that represent or demonstrate their experience. So the photograph becomes a form of them sharing their voice and story. Participants select what they photograph, and then they take the picture and describe the photo and the meaning to the researcher. These descriptions can be verbal or written. In photo elicitation, participants are provided the photo by the researcher, and then within the context of their experience are asked to share the meaning as it relates to their experience. And the researcher may also access artifacts as a point of data collection. This can be cultural artifacts such as work, artwork, memorabilia, or other items that are important to the group or the culture. And artifacts can also be documents such as policies, procedures, or historical documents. Data analysis and qualitative research will vary depending upon the methodology. However, there are some commonalities that we can discuss. First of all, in qualitative research, immersion in the data is crucial. And this immersion in the data provides a key component of trustworthiness known as prolonged engagement. Immersion in the data includes spending focused, reflective time with all sources of data and it can include reading the data multiple times, listening to audio recordings, or viewing video recordings. Data analysis and qualitative research is often simultaneous with data collection. For example, in a phenomenological study, the researcher may be conducting an interview and observe and note that a particular term is used repeatedly. This term may then evolve into a code or a theme. In grounded theory, analysis of one participant's interview would then suggest additional points to consider in subsequent interviews. In an ethnographic study, an interview with a key informant might offer observations on which to focus during a town hall meeting. In each of these ways, the analysis of the researcher aids in guiding the next steps of the study's data collection. When focusing on the data for detailed analysis, one method of analysis is through coding. In coding, the researcher reads the data multiple times and seeks words or brief phrases that seem to capture something meaningful through which significant statements are extracted. This is then given a description that becomes a code. Once all of the data is analyzed and coded, the researcher groups these together to become themes or categories. Themes are overarching descriptions that can narrate the experience of the participants as it relates to the phenomenon of interest. In phenomenology, coding is performed individual on each data set, and the data sets are not compared. However, grounded theory uses the constant comparative method. In the constant comparative method, open coding occurs in which a list of codes is formed. Each data set is analyzed individually to determine if any new codes arise. However, the open coding list is then compared against each data set to find similarities and differences between each data set. Ethnography seeks categories or relationships within the data with a goal of looking for the meaning of cultural symbols. And these cultural symbols can be written, spoken, or other forms. The language of the group is analyzed for relationships that are present within the culture or social group. Now let's talk about trustworthiness and rigor in your study. There's several considerations that are unique to qualitative research. First, ethical requirements mandate the protection of human subjects. Because qualitative research explores the experience of individuals who are sharing their story, it is imperative that the highest ethical standards are met. And this requires for planning for and incorporating ethical review through an institutional review board to ensure objective outside review of the research project. Another issue with qualitative research is that it typically takes place in naturalistic settings, especially when data is collected through observations. This prompts the questions already mentioned, such as whether everyone being observed must give consent, what should the researcher do when everyone present doesn't give consent, and whether seeking consent changes the behaviors of those observed. Another component of qualitative research is that of informed consent. Participants will need to give consent, and this is typically done through an informed consent document that gathers the participants' agreement and signature. However, qualitative research is not always a one-time singular interaction. For this reason, process consent should be incorporated. In process consent, the researcher seeks the consent or the agreement of the participant with each interaction. And this can be done verbally, but it conveys to the participant that their right to autonomy is valid and acknowledged. Another issue with qualitative research is the emerging nature of the design. So for example, the participants may disclose information that changes the perspective of the study. And this must be acknowledged and addressed through the researcher keeping an audit trail through audit trail memos. This can provide a rationale for any changes that are made in the study procedures or focus, and some of these changes may warrant an additional review by the institutional review board. Another issue is because the researcher and the participant often develop a vulnerable yet trusting relationship, there is the risk of the process becoming therapeutic or clinical. The researcher must remain in the role of researcher and realize that they are not a counselor or therapist, nor are they in the role of the nurse or healthcare provider during the data collection process. However, if the participant discloses something that is concerning, the researcher can and should direct the participant to appropriate medical care or other resources. And these may need to be factored in the design of the study. Another risk is that of the participant disclosing confidential information, such as criminal activity or an intent to harm themselves or others. And this poses an ethical concern, and the researcher should collaborate with their IRB on how to handle any such situations. However, to maintain the trusting relationship with the participants, the researcher must remain objective and non-judgmental. Finally, in qualitative research, the researcher is viewed as an instrument. As such, the researcher has the power to influence the information gathered and the outcome of the study. So the researcher must acknowledge and manage any bias that might be present. This is necessary to ensure that the findings reflect the participant's view rather than the view of the researcher. As we think about trustworthiness and qualitative research, this parallels internal validity found in quantitative studies. Trustworthiness is that which persuades the audience that the findings have value and merit. There are several measures of trustworthiness. First, we have credibility, which can best be explained in that participants would feel that the findings are truthful and represent their experience. Member checking aids in ensuring credibility. This includes authenticity to aid in the fairness and usability of the study. Consistency, also known as auditability, is similar to dependability. And this means that there is accountability present for the researcher so that you can follow the steps of the researcher throughout the entire process. It should be as clear as a recipe that another researcher could replicate. Auditability is present when description of the study offers that recipe so it can be replicated. Authenticity aids in the fairness and usability of a study. And this demonstrates that access to participants is fair and that those who participated were treated fairly and ethically. Finally, we have fittingness or transferability of the study. Transferability is the extent to which the findings can be applied in another context or with other similar populations. For example, if transferability is present in a study of adolescents receiving peritoneal dialysis and attending a high school and a public school, the findings would likely be transferable to the same type of students in a private school setting. Transferability is enhanced when the findings are faithful to the participant's reality. There's multiple ways in which trustworthiness can be enhanced. The first is through member checking. In member checking, the researcher returns to the participants to validate or verify the findings before they're finalized. Prolonged engagement is as previously described when the researcher immerses themselves in collecting data, reviewing data, and analyzing data. And this can be done through lengthy periods of time spent with the participants or through the rigor of time spent with the data as you're analyzing. Peer debriefing involves an individual who's not connected with the study, serving to review the protocols and the information to identify anything that is implicit only to the researcher. In other words, your peer debriefer is an objective individual who can help maintain focus on the purpose of the study and help the researcher avoid any bias or incorporation of assumptions into the design of the study or the findings. Triangulation is present when there's different modes of data collection or points of view. And this can be through collecting data from various sources with different methods, different investigators, or using different theories. As an example, if a researcher conducts interviews with participants and asks them to keep a journal, this would provide triangulation through multiple methods of data collection. An audit trail is a means of being transparent and describing the steps of a research study, beginning with development of the project all the way through to dissemination of findings. This can be done through memos to detail the steps of the research process and should include rationales for decisions made during the study. Reflexive journaling can be part of the audit trail because it records activities and decisions of the researchers. But reflexive journaling is more than documenting the actions and the rationales. In reflexive journaling, the researcher writes about the process and research activities and is transparent about their awareness of the interconnectivity between themselves, the participants, and the data. It's a process of examining yourself as a researcher and your relationship to the research. Next, we're going to talk about some considerations for mixed methods research. A mixed method study is exactly what it sounds like, using both qualitative and quantitative methods in one study. In a mixed method study, the order of data collection may vary. In one study, the researcher may complete the qualitative component first, and in others, the quantitative component may occur first and then be followed with a qualitative component with either all or a subset of the sample. The qualitative and quantitative components may also occur simultaneously. The methodology for any study should always be guided by the research question. So you should not choose mixed method approaches unless the question can only be answered in this way. The data from different sources can be used to corroborate, elaborate, and illuminate to provide information. Combining the story uncovered through a qualitative component with statistical data may provide the most complete and accurate account of the phenomenon of interest. Mixed method studies may provide an opportunity to increase the rigor of a study by increasing the strength and consistency of the findings. However, this rationale should be used with caution because a mixed method study does not automatically make the findings and the evidence stronger. In fact, a poorly done mixed method study could weaken the findings and make them less credible. This is an example of a mixed method study. Improving the quality of life and self-care of adolescents receiving peritoneal dialysis. The quantitative component may have a large sample that uses tools to measure quality of life and self-care behaviors. And then the qualitative component could narrow down into a subset of the sample who would participate in individual interviews. And that could look at motivators and barriers to self-care. And this subset may be selected by looking at those participants who had high quality of life and effective use of self-care behaviors, and another subset that looks at those who have low quality of life. In this section, we'll cover reporting qualitative and mixed methods research from the perspective of preparing a proposal for a research project. Items included in a research proposal will often be the same items you would include in a research report. Your research plan or proposal is how you convince the audience that there is a need for your study, that there's a gap in the literature or nursing knowledge that calls for the study, and that you have organized an appropriate plan to fill that gap in knowledge that is present. To have a solid proposal, the first thing you need to do is read the instructions, and I can't emphasize that enough. You need to make sure you know what the reviewer expects and what is required of you. This includes reviewing any rubrics or scoring sheets provided. Once you've read the instructions, make sure to follow those. You don't want your proposal to be rejected because you didn't follow the submission instructions. Within your proposal, you need to clearly convey what you intend to do. This means you need to be incredibly clear with the purpose or aim of your study. You also need to clearly convey the reason why the work is needed or why it's significant. You'll often hear reviewers ask, "So what?" And this is because often we are curious about something, but we haven't established significance or the so what for a study. Your proposal should clearly convey the significance. The next point is to make sure you clearly convey what has already been done related to the phenomenon or topic of interest. And this includes identifying a gap in the literature that confirms that there's a lack of nursing knowledge or science related to the topic and phenomenon. This helps you show how you would fill the gap you've identified. And your proposal should also clearly convey how you'll do the work to fill this gap. This is done by clearly conveying your proposed study design. So what about the components to be in your proposal? First, you need to clearly include your problem statement. This is a statement of why the study is important and should clearly convey the problem can be addressed by nursing. Next, offer the research question the study seeks to answer. A qualitative study will not have a hypothesis. However, if you are proposing a mixed method study, you should have a research question for the qualitative component and one for the quantitative component. The quantitative component question would need to have a hypothesis included. Specific aims should also be addressed in the proposal, offering the short and long-term aims or objectives of the study. This is where you would also offer the outline or the timetable for achieving the aims. You must also include the background and significance of the study. Offer the background through a literature review to evaluate what is already known and to identify the gaps the project will fill. If you're proposing a mixed method study, then you should also briefly summarize the theoretical or conceptual framework for the quantitative arm of the study. This is the section in which you'll explain the significance and importance of your study and how it will contribute to nephrology nursing. Next, address any preliminary studies you've participated in that are relevant to this proposal. We'll cover research design and methods on the next slide, but this will need to be clear and easy to follow. And finally, you must address how you will protect your subjects, whether these are humans or animals. You should address whether you will protect your subjects, including how you will maintain anonymity or confidentiality of your participants. IRB approval should be addressed, and you should also address approval from any other entity necessary to conduct your study. For ANNA grant proposals, you'll also need to complete training on human subject protection and include a copy of the consent document for review. You'll also include a detailed budget. The research design and methods section of your proposal should be clear enough for anyone to follow. State your methodology, keeping in mind that the methodology is your research approach, such as phenomenology, etc. The method is the overall design of the study to describe how you will carry out the study activities. Offer a brief description of the methodology so the reviewer can evaluate whether the methodology is appropriate to answer the research question and to fulfill the purpose of the study. Then describe your participants. This should include a description of the participants, such as inclusion and exclusion criteria, how you'll recruit your sample, and your proposed sample size. Make sure to include a rationale for each of these decisions, especially the sample size. If you're conducting a quantitative component, you'll also need to include power analysis to justify your sample size. For the qualitative component, you will need to address ensuring data saturation. If you're conducting a mixed method study, you'll address the key variables present. Next, address how you'll collect your data. Be clear and specific. For example, if you'll conduct interviews, how will these be carried out and will they be recorded in any way? If you're using any instruments for data collection, you should describe these and include the reliability and validity information with the description. Attach the instruments to your proposal. Offer a description of how you'll analyze your data. As you address data collection, make sure to include how you will store your data and who will have access to this. For qualitative components, you should clearly describe the analysis method. For quantitative components, offer the data analysis approach and include any appropriate statistical tests that will be performed. Address how you intend to report the findings and mention your plans for dissemination. Next, discuss the feasibility of conducting your study, such as the availability of participants, maintaining contact with participants over extended period of time, and anticipated response rates. There should be acknowledgement of any potential limitations and how you'll mitigate these, as well as addressing any difficulties that may be present. And finally, offer a proposed timetable from the beginning to the completion of the project. Rigor of the study should also be addressed in the proposal, such as identifying how you will provide trustworthiness. And finally, these are some references that may be helpful to you in planning to conduct a qualitative study. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out, and this now concludes our presentation.